Welcome, everyone. Perfection Learning is so excited to have you join us for tonight's webinar, Current Events in Your AP Government Classroom. I'm Kristen Hipwell, our Director of Marketing, and it is my pleasure to introduce the two experts leading the way this evening. First, I'd like to introduce you to Brian Stevens. Brian teaches several AP courses, including AP Government and Politics and AP U.S. History. He's also a consultant for the College Board and has conducted workshops for AP Government teachers throughout the United States. And Brian serves as a reader and a table leader for the AP Government readings. We're also happy to have David Wolfford sharing his expertise this evening. David is a full-time teacher of government history and other social studies courses, and is also a brilliant writer. And that's the world where we at Perfection Learning know him best. David has written for national magazines and local newspapers, covering politics, campaigns, elections, and public figures. And he's been published in a variety of scholarly journals. David has also created his own website, USGOPO.com, where he provides original activities, handouts, references, and test prep materials for students and teachers. But our favorite credential on David's resume is that he authored Perfection Learning's Advanced Placement United States Government and Politics coursebook by AMSCO. And that, of course, is why David is leading us in tonight's webinar. Welcome to David and Brian, and welcome to all of you joining us tonight. Thanks for being here. David, I'm going to pass it off to you now to get started.
Hello, everyone. David Wolfford here, and thanks for joining us for this conversation about current events. And Brian will be joining us here in a few seconds, hopefully. But just it's thrilling to be here. I wanted to simply talk to you a little bit about current events and a current events program in your classroom. So we've got a bit of a slideshow. We want to talk a little bit about current events and the media and journalism, and that's really part of what we do as government teachers, of course, is to convey current event, the news, profiles, things like that. And so we'll show you some examples tonight. We're going to talk about questions, good sources, things like that. So thanks for joining us. The first thing that might come up in your decision on how to do this is the timing and how much time you want to devote to current events and when you would carry this out, what kind of program. And people do it differently. Brian and I both have talked about how it's sort of something you want to pepper your semester with or your year with, and consider what you're also teaching. The timing's never going to be perfect in terms of the events happening, whether or not they match up perfectly with what you've either just taught or what you're about ready to teach. So we've sort of decided that it's good to teach current events kind of as they come. And if something happens, like Congress passes a massive bill, and you haven't really covered the Congress yet, and it's hitting the news, it's probably good to go ahead and cover that program or that piece or that event, and you can kind of explain it on the way. So you sort of interject the elements from the CED or the elements from your curriculum into your schedule kind of spontaneously. Now, the students aren't going to know every single element in that current events factor, but they're going to be able to figure it out as they go. So, and I want to go ahead and introduce my website a little bit here. And we'll show you how this is going to work, but at USGOPO.com, you can frequently kind of see my method here. If you go over to the right and you click on weekly current events, you'll get a sampling of the three articles I choose. That's usually what I do each week is try to eat, not every week, but maybe at least every other week. And usually I post on Sunday 3 selected articles that I expect the students to read by Tuesday. So it gives them a couple days to sort of get with it and find them and all that. And here's just a quick example of what you'll see, and you'll see some questions that go along with that there. So that's sort of the basic mode that we're going to work with here. But back to our a slideshow here, we want to bear with me here, I apologize. We want to consider these things. We also want to consider reading level. There'll be some sources that will be very interesting to us as teachers and amateur political scientists that might not necessarily be great for the students or a little bit too advanced. At some schools you've got the option of video, news clips that you can use. It never hurts to bring in student interest, like articles that students are actually have a high level of interest, even if they're not that hot on government right now. So minimize this screen here and looking to see us on the screen. Brian, are you with us now?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm gonna let Brian kind of introduce himself to just kind of let us know he's with us here. I'm had the pleasure to know Brian for a little over 20 years, and he's been kind of the inspiration in the teaching government. He's a consultant with the AP college board programs in the summer and that kind of stuff. So go ahead and just kind of give yourself a little introduction here while we're considering current events.
All right. Thank you, Dave. I apologize to everyone. I don't understand why the video is not working. I guess you just don't get to see my handsome mug tonight, but you get to hear me. So Brian Stevens, I'm a AP government teacher in Coldwater, Michigan. And as Dave said, I've been a consultant, AP reader, table leader, done some reviewing for books, and the honor to review Dave's book, the last couple of editions. So I'm happy to be here tonight, and I'm going to be Dave's wingman. I'll chime in every so often. So thanks for having me, Dave.
Oh, no problem. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're connected, even if we have some video trouble. But been talking a little bit about the timing and trying to hit news stories when they're hot without worrying too much if you've covered every element of that topic from within the curriculum. Sources are a good thing to consider here. So got a few select sources. That's very important to get the legitimate reporting and a lot of political news out there. Brian, what are some of the sources that you tend to like to go to?
Well, are we going to go to the media bias chart pretty quick here?
Pretty soon. Go ahead and we can do that if you like.
I was thinking about this, Dave. So when we're doing current events and we're trying to do something topical, I'm really looking for videos that are more informational than anything, because with my students, probably like a lot of you out there, and as Dave mentioned, they aren't necessarily very well versed in government. So particularly early in the year like this, I'm looking for videos on YouTube, looking at PBS, sometimes the major news channels, some that are a little bit less biased, but I'm really looking for videos that are informational more than anything else, because I really can't count on the students having a good handle on anything that's going on in the world and American politics at any given time.
Mm-hmm. Right. Why PBS? You mentioned PBS. Why do you? I would agree that that's a good source. What's your reasoning for that?
Well, once again, it's you really kind of get away from the bias. It's like I said, it's very straightforward, very informational. It gives students a good handle on whatever the topic is. So, for example, last week I thought it was pretty hot topic with the incident with General Milley and what happened with him and the so-called back channels that were going on. And I used the PBS video, and it tied in very well to studying the Constitution. And we tried to bring in this idea of commander in chief, and the process of being commander in chief. It was kind of interesting because the whole intent of the founding fathers was to have a civilian in the head of the military. But in this particular instance, you could make an argument that the military was checking on the president. So I thought that was really interesting for the students to be able to deal with that. But I definitely used the PBS video because, like I said, it really doesn't try to convey any particular bias. At least I don't think it does.
I would agree with that too. The PBS is bare bones news, but complete. Their video presentations tend to be probably between 6 and 12 minutes long for each piece. It's in-depth news. Been pretty consistent since about 1968 when it started. So I would endorse it as well. It's the right length, not a lot of flash. 60 minutes pieces too are typically free and accessible. That kind of comes and goes sometimes, but they're pretty reliable. And each news piece is probably about 11 to 12 minutes in reality. So those are good. Politico, you see down here in the bottom left of your screen, John Harris, one of the founders of Politico, and they really pioneered online political reporting. And they've been doing it right ever since they got started. Sometimes I'll find their articles are a little advanced for, high school readers, even at the AP track. But Politico, I would endorse as a good source. And Real Clear Politics, a good place to every Sunday morning. I usually kind of stop by there and see what they've got going on, see if there's any worthy news articles or op-eds or anything. So those are some good places to start. There's other video too. Video clips. We see here. Obama's press secretary here. I thought this was a nice shot to kind of remind us of what a press conference is like. We're starting to see a lot more frequently. A full press conference might be a bit long for a current events assignment overnight, but you can find sources that have already cut it down, or you could, if you're skilled with C-SPAN's program. C-SPAN has a function. You can get an account and go on there and you can kind of edit a little bit or cut some video, or with YouTube. So those are always good ideas. Today, for example, I haven't really picked up too much on exactly what was said at the UN, but Biden gave a speech at the UN, probably too long to watch it entirely maybe, but you can assign clips from it or find a good link on that.
Hey, Dave.
Yes, sir.
I want to ask you a question. So when I saw on the prior, you were listing like some of the considerations for current events. So are you looking at timing with current events, timing it with whatever you're studying that time? Or are you more prone to saying, oh, this is something important that our students need to be aware of and willing to share that current event? So are you guided by what you're studying at that time, or are you more guided by what's happening at that time?
I would say both. Sometimes there's a lightning strikes just perfectly and something happens right when you're in the middle of talking about a program. There's a few times a year it seems like the textbook and the real world events were kind of aligned perfectly. But I kind of mentioned a little bit about this earlier. It's also worthy to stop and introduce a vocab word or a concept, even if you haven't gone to that chapter yet. If it's hot in the news, students will remember it. Something they're seeing on the television or in their news feed. I think it's worth overlap. Now I teach on a full year. Perhaps half of y'all out there do not. So that's a little bit easier to do that kind of thing. But it seems to me to be useful to not sweat too much if you covered that topic or not.
I think that's a great point, Dave, that bringing in the vocab. And if we look at the CED, that would be in the area of essential knowledge. And I think you're absolutely correct that you can introduce essential knowledge now that you may not have covered, but it'll stick with the students and it'll resonate. So when you do get to that area, they're somewhat familiar with it. So I really, really like that idea that you have of introducing vocab, even though it may not be like what you're particularly studying at that time. I think it's a great idea.
Well, let's take a look here. You brought up the media bias chart, and there's never been a better time to have a very good referee in the room than now. And I have, for those of you out there who, some of you will be very familiar with this device, the media bias chart. This is produced by an attorney out west by the name of Vanessa Otero, who came up with this concept. And let's just take a look real quick. I hope this works out. We've got a quick video here of her explaining the media bias chart. So I believe we're out there, people are seeing it. So this video, and it's linked up in the PowerPoint that's going to be available when this is over. And it's also, if you go to my site and punch in media bias in the search box, this will come up pretty handily. So let's take a quick look at her methodology and her invention.
Active on social media will recognize.
It really started in 2016 in the run-up to the last presidential election. I just started becoming very alarmed about the kind of quality and bias of information that people would use to support their arguments to their friends on Facebook. I thought it might be helpful to just kind of map it like better, worse, left and right. So I just started piecing it together on my own just to explain to my friends. We've had this overabundance and proliferation of online news sources, and most of it is in the area of analysis and opinion. If people understood that the sources they're consuming are actively making them angrier and polarizing them, then they might choose to consume less of that.
Otero's chart categorizes the media landscape using two domains: facts versus editorializing, and left versus right-leaning views.
It's a two-dimensional taxonomy. So the vertical axis is quality. So in general, the best quality stuff is at the top, and the lowest quality stuff is at the bottom. The horizontal axis is bias. So you have like your neutral or balanced stuff in the middle.
Viewers will recognize big names like CNN and Fox News, but Otero says she's starting to get requests to add smaller outlets too. Extreme partisan sources like Breitbart and Wonkette appear at the ends of the axes. As a whole, the chart provides a frame of reference for a news industry that is growing increasingly partisan.
So much of the the content that we consume right now is telling you how you should feel about a subject. The stories, like when they break, and then what they the spin on them, the takes on them 24 hours later, are really revealing.
Believe it or not, social scientists don't think the polarized media climate has done much permanent damage to democracy yet. But it's not exactly harmless either. An analysis of Nielsen data from the Knight Foundation shows a widening gap between liberals who say they trust the media and conservatives who say they don't. The Pew Research Center finds that the most partisan among us are more likely to be steering the broader political conversation. A comprehensive chart of political media, then, could serve as a sort of guide for those who want to make up their own minds. Or, to hear Otero tell it,
what the media bias chart is an anchor.
Of course, Otero is just one person with her own biases and blind spots.
I've taken into account certain criticisms. I have actually made adjustments to certain sources, especially from some of the really earlier versions. If the sample was really unfair that I selected, and I can go back and look at that and take those comments into account. Comments from a lot of the readers of that source and other sources.
Until now, Otero has mostly managed the project herself. But she recently finished crowdfunding more than $32,000 to hire more analysts, vet more sources, and make her charting process more transparent.
Right now, there are 104 sources. We'd like to include, expand to 200, 300, 400 sources pretty soon on an interactive web-based version. but there's a limit to what I can do on my own. I've developed really robust methodologies, really granular methodologies, the headline, the picture or graphic, the lead or the chyron, and then the individual sentences for quality and bias. I've just started recruiting a team of analysts to help me do that. I just really felt a responsibility to improve that as much as I could because people are relying on it. And I just fundamentally feel that if you're going to put out information that influences people, which this does, then you have a responsibility to make it as good as you can.
In the future, Otero hopes her chart could be a sort of Consumer Reports for media ratings, both in terms of its comprehensive reach and its reputation as a reliable guide.
I want to make the news consumers smarter and the news media itself better. And those things are both really lofty, but I think it's doable. There are folks who just, if they had this information, would make better choices as consumers of media first and then citizens.
So let's talk about this a little bit here. Let me get the slide back up. The media bias chart, and really, I'm not sure if people are seeing me or not right now or my screen, but years I've been using this media bias chart somewhat in school for a while, and probably something I wouldn't have shown till we got to the media unit. But what I've noticed is it's kind of good early in the year, as you know, maybe before you even start assigning current events articles, is to discuss this idea of bias. Now, students will often, that are a little more intense or care, or maybe they're a little ideologically on one side or the other, will sort of scream bias or claim bias. And I noticed when I asked them, how do you measure bias? How would one even really get into the weeds of doing that? A lot of times they've never really thought that through. They've never really done these kind of measurements, of course, and they've just heard that as a claim for when they don't like what they're hearing from the media. Now, of course, there is media bias, and it's something we've got to teach, something in the CED. So what I've been doing the last couple of years is introducing this chart, really introduce the methodology. Now, notice, folks, I showed you the video first, or tried to anyway. I think you caught a glimpse of the chart before we saw the video, but it might be good to teach the methodology that she uses and get the concept down there before you actually even show the chart. Because there will be some students who see this chart and they see one of their favorite media outlets that's been pegged as a little bit to one side or the other. They might get defensive. So it's kind of like introducing the rules of the game before you play the game, and then asking the students, do we all agree on these rules? Do we think this is a good idea? And then you can kind of put that out there. Now, like she explained, really, look who's at the top of this. Is the Associated Press, really. The premier, it makes total sense. They're the premier news delivery system in the country for really 100+ years. When I set up my current events each week, that's another first stop I make. USA Today, AP News, and that's why they're there at the crown of this parabola, which measures from a right to left perspective on how trustworthy the media is, and then from a kind of a top to down perspective on how reliable and how truthful or how ridiculous it might be. So it's useful when students claim that, well, that must become, if they read assign an article that they may not like what it said, or it might be critical of a Republican or Democrat, and they become a little defensive. It's easy to say, hey, the experts have a pretty high reliability on this. We usually, if you can see my arrow there, we usually I try to get them to rely on the sources sort of within this kind of circle here. And every now and then, it's not a bad idea to lay an article in front of the students that is biased, that does have an ideological slant. And the first question might be the next day in class, so was this writer conservative or liberal? See if what they picked up on it. Now, I'll let Brian talk a little bit about this too. Some teachers might be a little more prone to only pick front page type news, AP news, traditional, unbiased media. Some others will not. There's sort of a bit of a difference on that. I was going to get his take Brian, get your take on, what's safe to assign and what might not be so safe to assign, or you might want to be cautious about it.
Well, I think, first of all, I think this chart's awesome. I really do. And one thing I'm looking at the chart and just kind of working with the students is, there's lots of media outlets here. How familiar are they with a lot of these outlets? So I think there's going to take some education on our part. And I imagine, Dave, maybe you assign students like different media outlets for them to be able to kind of research and get things from. I just kind of assume that you do that. But we can't assume that they know a lot about a lot of these different outlets. I think, like, to me, the Wall Street Journal is like the epitome of what we're talking about and what I was mentioning before. So the Wall Street Journal, to me, is a great informational outlet to use. Like, if you read their regular articles and reporting on things, I think it's pretty straightforward and pretty good. Now, where they tilt to the right is with their op-eds and their editorials and things like that, where there definitely is a bias. So I would not be hesitant to use the Wall Street Journal at all. I get it myself with students because I think the reporting is great. Where you might come into a little bit of an issue is if you have them read an editorial or something along those lines. Those tend to be pretty biased, but I wouldn't hesitate to use the Wall Street Journal at all. I think it's a really good resource. I think that kind of.
I wouldn't either. I would agree with that completely. The Wall Street Journal is respectable. Yes, their editorial pages are a little bit to the right, generally on business. They probably, they're not exactly, I don't know how ideological they are on the non-fiscal issues. But I would agree with that completely. Another thing to consider if you're in a community or you've had any heat from any parents, or, people will jump to conclusions. You assign maybe a little bit of a edgy article or an op-ed, and a parent reads it and gets fired up, and maybe you get an email. It's good to convey to both the students and any parents that, hey, look, I hope that you want me to expose your child to these different elements of the media, and I'm not everything that I assign to them do I even agree with, and they're not going to be able to counter things or think for themselves if we only assign very cleansed and acceptable, neutral and vanilla reporting. So that's a good, I think that's the right way to go.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct on this. And also, if I could share with our viewers too, everybody here has a different situation, different clientele and that sort of thing. Okay. And Dave, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but, and I feel this way about a lot of different homework type ideas, but when you assign, I don't have the type of students that I can give them this article and I say, read it. Okay. And come back the next day and discuss it. They're going to have some tangible reward, at least my kids, in order to get them to read these kinds of things. So I would most likely, regardless of if it's a videotape or article from the Wall Street Journal, I'm going to give them some type of tangible incentive to do it, points or whatever the case may be. And I was talking to Dave about this a little bit earlier. I'll just share this real quickly. It's a very simple device I use for current events. It's called 3-2-1. So I might have the students read an article and write down 3 facts they learned, 2 questions they have, and 1 opinion about the article. It's very straightforward. It's very simple, but you'll be pretty amazed what some of the kids come up with, particularly with the questions. So that just is something that works for me. It works with videos, works with articles, whatever the case may be. But I just parting that's my little bit of wisdom that I'm going to share with you is that, I just don't think nowadays we can just give a kid an article or a video and say, watch it. And with my kids, unless there's some kind of incentive, they probably won't. I just wanted to share that with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree too. There has to be an incentive. Now, do you have, just so we know, do they kind of arrive to, if they're doing what they're supposed to do and what you've assigned, that 3-2-1, do they arrive with that in hand and hand that to you, or do they submit it through, whatever? you recommend that kind of thing, or in an online, however people are collecting homework these days?
Either way. I mean, I've done it through Google Classroom and having them watch a video and do a 3, 2, 1, or I've even done this in the course of a class. So even showing them a short 8 to 10 minute clip on a current event to make sure they're watching, I can assign them a 3, 2, 1. And usually what I'll do is, like, at the end of the video clip, I'll give them about a minute or so to catch up, write that extra question, write that opinion, whatever the case may be, right? But it's been a really successful device just to, to have the kids pay attention to whatever we're doing that particular day.
I would agree. Let's go ahead and we'll talk a little bit about questions too here. That's another incentive. If they know they're going to get questioned either when they get back into class, or they're going to get some type of quiz or something like that. What I usually do is, I don't do a quiz every time, but I do a quiz enough, often enough to where that's always looming and that's possible. But then I also have my class discussion questions that I generally write up ahead of time. Now, we're all busy people. There are some weeks, surely, where I don't exactly draft the question. I might print the article out and highlight, or couple 3 articles, whatever you're doing, whatever your mode is. And sometimes you're busy. You could perhaps assign the article before you've even fully digested it. You can kind of know if it's going to be safe and relevant and all that. Or maybe you've read and highlighted it, and you can stand up there at the podium with your copy of it, and you will come up with questions for discussion or get them to talk about it. But when you do have time, a plan ahead of questions is good. Let's take a look here at, this was about a week ago or so, or the California recall, which is now over. Let's all just take a minute without me reading these to you. Just everybody, let's take about a minute or so and glance at these questions and notice the order and the difficulty and how they begin and end. I'm just going to kind of sit back and let everybody kind of digest this.
Hey, Dave.
Yes, sir.
After we do this, there were a couple questions on the chat that I'd like to address, but we'll obviously do this first.
I think we might be going to do those at the end. So hang loose. We'll make sure that they do get answered. If you could jot them down.
Okay.
Or don't forget them. But I think we're going to do all the questions kind of once we wrap up, which we're getting close to that. Now, hopefully, you folks who are checking this out, one thing you'll notice right away is I always start with a real basic question, just to kind of make sure, an easy one, a softball pitch, kind of get us oriented in the class. Then I get into some more of the bigger details, and I like to finish with a higher thinking question, kind of take them on through that. And at the end, quite often, get the student to express an opinion or make a prediction or something like that. So this is a good day. This would I might not type these up every time for every article, but I generally do. And if you guys are interested, you folks watching this, on Sunday afternoon, at least by Monday morning, you can find that on my website. Usually 3 relevant articles. Hopefully they're useful to you, and the questions are typed up in a PDF. So. Just something to think about there. I didn't know if you wanted to comment on these questions, Brian. You can chime in here if you want.
Well, yeah, I think this is great, Dave. It's a lot more thorough than I'm usually used to doing. But what I like about this is you're asking these questions that force the students to delve into the article or the video. So if I ever get opportunity to do these sort of things, I like to do this. This technique, Dave, actually would work well. Probably a lot of people are familiar with the Edpuzzles. Are you familiar with Edpuzzle, Dave?
I'm not.
So Edpuzzle allows you to take a video and insert your own questions, and they can be true or false. They can multiple choice or something along those lines. But what you're doing here would work well with the Edpuzzle app. I think it would be awesome. And the other nice thing about using Edpuzzle with this type of a format is, once again, there's the accountability piece. Okay, So they're answering the questions as they go through the video, and you can give them credit for that, and it's relatively easy to do. So I would advise people to use Edpuzzle and pose these types of questions to their students.
I see. That sounds like a good idea. You know, and these questions, if you want, in some classes for some teachers, you could assign these questions overnight, kind of like your 3-2-1. You could, or maybe take half of them for homework and half of them are asked in class. Some students sort of need a little bit of better orientation and direction. I usually don't. I usually kind of just have, in an AP class, have the questions as sort of the incentive to come in there and be ready to start answering these. But you know, it's kind of up to you. Putting them out there and making them public might be a better idea. So we've discussed some of these expectations and routines. You know, you get in a rhythm, whether you do this monthly, weekly would be pretty darn often. I don't quite make it weekly, but probably 2 to 3 times a month. For you folks teaching on a shorter schedule, you might need to work that in. For some of us, you might even allot class time. Sometimes a Monday morning is good for all of us to have something for them to read, and it's fresh, and you can discuss it by the end of class, sort of thing. Let's see here what else we've got. You know, this is a useful slide that you can take, and these are the roles. You remember these, Brian? I don't know how much the AP and college boards are emphasizing these like they used to, but these 3 chief roles of the media.
I would say in the media is part of Unit 5, and it doesn't get a lot of press. It doesn't get a lot of time. But if there were 3 things that I would make sure my students know from that chapter, the media would be scorekeeper, gatekeeper, and watchdog. I think those could show up on the AP test very easily on a multiple choice question or as an FRQ. So I think, to me, talking about essential knowledge, these 3 terms are absolutely pivotal for the media, absolutely pivotal.
Well, and once you've taught it, you know, you might teach this in the unit in mid-year, or you might teach it at the beginning, but a slide like this to have handy to pop up after they've read an article or so, and then ask them, you know, let's remind ourselves, what are these 3 roles, and what role did the journalist or the media outlet play in this article you just read? You know, it's kind of a good way to reminders, a good reminder. So I chose these images. Horse race journalism is a common term that appears frequently on the AP tests we've seen. You know, especially in election season, campaign season, you'll see a lot of that. Then gatekeeper, whether or not what the degree to which the news decides what's worthy, what's going to make it to above the fold of the newspaper for you traditional print subscribers out there that we still have. And then of course Brian will tell you who we have here at the bottom, I'm sure, the epitome of the watchdogs.
I thought that was you and me. 30 years ago.
We could only wish, but we've got Woodward and Bernstein down there, really kind of defined investigative journalism back in the 70s, and with Watergate and all. And as we could tell, they're both still around, and one of them I think has a new book coming out any minute now.
Peril,
so,
yeah. Yeah, and
another
then
useful device is to just kind of have some of your media terms at the ready. You know, again, these will be the kind of thing you'd see at the end of a chapter, a list of terms like in the AMSCO book that we did. But it might be handy to have these sort of at the reach. You can put them on a screen. They're not going to all be relevant with every article, but with each current events assignment, you can probably remind them what some of these terms mean, and what kind of genre we just read, you know, after assigning the pieces.
Dave, I think that things like this are extremely important. I know with the redesign, we are looking to try to get our students to be more critical thinkers, more deeper thinkers, be able to backup arguments. But the fact of the matter is, if they don't start off with a foundation, they're not going anywhere. So having access to these terms and having the students know these terms, once again, I think is so important. Sometimes I think teachers overlook it.
Well, feel free, any of you folks out there, to use these things. They'll be available when you get the webinar and such later. I believe that's going to be about it. A snapshot of USGOPO and where you can find weekly current events almost every Sunday evening or Monday morning, other than kind of holiday week. So hopefully that's helpful to you. That pretty much concludes the slideshow. I was going to turn this back over to Kristen, I believe, if she's ready here, or however we want to proceed, if we have any questions or whatever.
I will just let both of you know the questions that have been coming in from the participants. One thing I did want to mention, tomorrow morning, we will email out to all participants the recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck. So you will have access to all the information that has been shared tonight. One question was David's website. So I want to make sure you saw that just a minute ago. It is USGOPO.com. So spelled out USGOPO.com. That was one question that has come in. In addition, we've had questions about the link to the YouTube video on the media bias chart that David had shared. You will note that in the chat, the link is actually posted, and we'll also have it included in what you receive tomorrow. Brian, can you clarify the exercise you suggested, the 3 facts, 2 questions, and 1 opinion? Can you tell us, do you do anything with the 3-2-1 exercise? Share them with partners or classmates, swap them to see if others can answer their questions?
Actually, I read those in the chat. Those are pretty good ideas. But typically what I like to do with that is I like to call on students. So we've watched a video or they bring in the 3-2-1 to class, and I'll call on students and say, okay, John, give me a fact that we learned, all right? And then they'll give me a fact, and if it's something that we can expand upon, we expand upon. Then I might ask a student for a question. And generally speaking, the questions generate more discussion than anything else. So when I use the 3-2-1, and this is kind of a Socratic method I'll use in class all the time, I really like to just call on students and not necessarily the ones that are typically raising their hands and contributing, but other students to give me a fact or give me a question, and then we'll go from there. Typically though, before we do the 3-2-1s, I also like either myself or I'll ask a student to give a synopsis of whatever that current event is. So we've got all on the same page, and then we can delve into the 3-2-1. But I really like the idea about the swapping with students. I get a little bit hesitant about those sort of things. I don't know about Dave, because I've got ideas of where I want to go with it. And sometimes students achieve that, sometimes they don't. So I get a little hesitant about that. But I think that that's also a good idea, is put them in like a think, pair, share sort of a scenario as far as that goes. But generally speaking, I like to lead it.
Great. I did want to just share a comment by one of the participants. This individual mentioned that Edpuzzle, which had been talked about, connects to Google Classroom.
Right. It's great. So your kids go ahead and do the Edpuzzle, and then you go to Google Classroom. Actually, you can access it on Edpuzzle or Google Classroom, but it actually, the scores show up on Google Classroom and you can access it that way. So yes, they are adjoined. It's a nice little piece.
Right, just a couple more questions, and David or Brian, you can decide who takes this one. Do you ever assign articles that would be considered edgy?
Well, you want to be, I'll address this a second. You do want to be cautious about that. And, you know, it depends on how edgy they are, I suppose. I had them doing for extra credit, a 9/11 movie review right around 9/11. That was an optional assignment, you know, Netflix or whatever, watch a 9/11 film, do a little research on it, give me a 500-word movie review, nothing major. And I came across an article that was in a publication I wasn't that familiar with. I think it's a men's publication called Inside the Hook. And it had one 4-letter word in it. Not the worst one we've ever seen, but one you wouldn't say in class either, that kind of thing. And, I decided to go ahead and go for it. And I put kind of a warning. The article itself was fine. The only flaws, it had one problem. I thought it was the perfect article for what they were doing. It was talking about how it's hard to make a 9/11 film, really, when sad. It was kind of making that point. Sometimes they're exploiting. And it was the perfect article except for that. But I went ahead and went for it, but I put sort of a PG designation article and let them know if they didn't want to read it, they didn't have to, but I've been teaching where I'm at for a while. I'm teaching 12th graders. I think that kind of stuff's okay. We're starting to see that in legitimate publications like a New Republic, National Review. You saw the bulwark in that media chart. We're starting to see a more casual presentation and occasionally filthy words, and expressions that we might not say as teachers in front of a classroom, but realistically, that's what the media is becoming. I'm not upset about it, so I'm a little bit more willing to go in that direction, maybe than if I was new in a school district or something like that.
Brian, any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess edgy is a relative word on how you go about using that. I'm not afraid to assign such things either. Obviously, you have parameters within your school and your school district, but I think this is something that people really have to consider. So, sometimes as teachers, we as government teachers, we're really scared about showing bias or doing something that might be offensive or so on and so forth. But the students, more important than that, they want to see that you're fair. So I would make sure that I would try to bring in articles or things that from both perspectives that are informational. But if they see that you're fair and you're willing to listen to all the different opinions and that sort of thing, then I think it creates an atmosphere in your class where you can bring these edgy things in and not really fear about kids overreacting to it. I think that fairness issue within your classroom is extremely important.
When you on edgy, just if I may, there's also a potential for, blood and guts in the news, or, crime, or, there's some stuff that, is on the 6:30 news that's not always for everybody. So, but I usually convey sometime early in the year, I might print something like this in a syllabus that, if it's on the news, if it's something that has been on the 6:30 news or 60 Minutes, or it's printed in the mainstream media, I kind of think it's fair game, and I've never had any trouble at all with parents on that. But it might be a good warning or disclaimer if you set up a standard like that, to just say, hey, you folks are 16, 17, 18, you're on your ways to being adults. You have to be able to consume this stuff and not be too shocked by it. And of course, there's always possibly something you still wouldn't show, so you always want to check it out and ask yourself that, or allow somebody if they want to leave the room, or if they don't want to, of the 3 pieces you're assigning, put that PG designation. If they want to opt out of that and it seems like it's a fair thing, then, let them do that.
We had a participant share comment was, I recommend all sides to present articles from left, right, and middle of the road viewpoints. Also, I recommend showing push polls from Democratic and Republican campaign sites. Those tend to be a good way to show the edginess.
I would agree with that too. I think all sides has a similar, it's kind of like that media bias chart, a little simpler and probably easier to digest, but I have put that up on my screen too. It's a similar concept, but probably more like 30 news outlets that are sort of arranged in the far left, far right, middle. So yeah, that's a good idea.
Dave, what's your thought about using the push polls though? They're kind of controversial, So how would you use push polls in class?
Well, I'm sure whoever was recommending that, I think it's not a bad idea. I sometimes talk about, push polling. We're talking about polls that are really not polls at all, but they're just advertisements, or they're ways to get donations. You'll get them on the phone, it's usually there's a slightly sinister voice. The recording of the robocall, or there could be, if it's printed, if you've got a good sniffer, you'll know if it's a push poll pretty quick. But I think it's probably a good idea for the students to see the difference between a neutral and legitimate scientific poll and one that's just meant to gin up outrage or cause somebody to get out a checkbook and make a donation, you know?
Okay, let's close out the question and comment session with just a comment that one of the participants included. I think it's a great real life example of doing exactly what we talked about tonight. He mentioned that the 3/5 compromise made national news last May with the Tennessee state legislator invoking it during debate. And he said he showed a news clip of that from the local Tennessee news about it when they were covering the 3/5 compromise last month in class. So real life example of sharing those current events at that perfect time.
I wonder how that came up.
Exactly.
Well, thank you to everyone for joining Perfection Learning and our esteemed speakers this evening. And thank you again to David and to Brian for leading the webinar and providing us with such valuable and useful information. We will be sending out the recording as well as the slide deck tomorrow morning, so please be watching for that. And to stay in the know on future webinars and other useful strategies for teaching APGov and other AP Social Studies courses, please be sure to sign up for Perfection Learning's blog, The Next Step. You can find that at nextstep.perfectionlearning.com, nextstep.perfectionlearning.com. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.